Today is April 29th, 2025. We are honored today to interview Mr. Donald A. Nicksay for the Veterans History Project, sponsored by the United States Library of Congress. My name is Donna Rich Stewart, and I'm here on behalf of the National Society Colonial Dames 17th Century Akia Chase Chapter. I'm joined by Mr. K. Edward Lynch of Advanda Videography, who is producer, director, and videographer, to capture the veteran's account and memories of his distinguished military service with the United States Air Force and his life after service. Here is Donald's story. Well, I'm honored to introduce Mr. Donald A. Nicksay, distinguished veteran of the United States Air Force. Good morning, and thank you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
It's just great, thank you.
Thank you for contributing to this program.
Well, it's a new experience for me. I'm looking forward to how it's going to go.
Yes, it will. The Library of Congress has been doing this since the year 2000.
Wow.
The Veterans History Project, and it's amazing.
How many have they collected? How many
Oh boy, that's a good question.
30,000 plus.
Really?
30,000.
30,000 stories.
And are they displayed, or is
Yes.
there a...
You can see them. I can see them on their website.
Oh, okay. And you could then access anybody who's been interviewed.
Yes.
If
Yes,
you know the
can.
name.
That's
Yeah.
right.
You have to know the name.
Have to know the name.
Well, I don't know. Memory catches up with a lot of us. So we had better do it before too much time passes
Probably.
by.
Yeah, that's right. And not all of them have the video portion, but all of them do have the data
Okay.
of
Yeah.
service record and documents that may have been uploaded to.
I see. Okay.
Well, I'd like to start at the beginning with you, Donald.
I was born.
You were born in the city of Arlington, near Boston, Massachusetts.
Well, it actually was in the city of Boston.
City of Boston.
Yes.
Okay, City of Boston. Your father was born in Arlington, right?
My father was born in Austria. Did I tell you that?
Yes. Let me start over.
Okay.
Okay, you were born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1928 to Frank K. Nicksay and Wilhelmira, Hain Nicksay. Your father was born in Austria and was an engineer. Also, he was assistant town manager of the city of Arlington in Massachusetts,
Mm-hmm.
which is great. So you tell us something about your parents and growing up in Massachusetts. Did you have siblings, for example?
I am an only child, and I grew up in what I would say a normal household. We lived in the town of Arlington throughout my first years of school. I went to the Russell School for the first 3 years, the Hardy School for 3 more years, which took me through the 6th grade, the Junior High School West, which took me through the 9th grade, then Arlington High School, which took me through the 12th grade. And I graduated in 1946.
So how did you come to be selected to attend Annapolis Naval Academy?
Well, that's kind of strange because going back to when I was maybe about 10 years old, I remember my father and I having a discussion about the Navy and the Naval Academy. He was a big fan of the Navy. I have to back up a minute and say when he was 17, he lied to get himself into the naval service during World War I, and he actually served in the Navy during the war, and after the war he was active in the American Legion. He was a member of the Arlington American Legion marching band, and so the Navy was a big thing with him. And when I was about 10, I remember him saying, he says, what about the Naval Academy? And I said, well, I've never heard of it. He sort of told me, he said, a school for Navy people in Annapolis, Maryland, and you could get in there by getting an appointment from your congressman. And I said, well, okay. And from that time on, I always had it in the back of my mind that I was going to go to the Naval Academy.
That's great.
And I don't know why, but I didn't put high on my list various local colleges and everything where I was normally planning to go to school after I graduated from high school. So when we kind of followed this, there was a Navy commander who lived in Arlington whom I got to know, I guess because I was working for a tree service company and we were cutting his lawn. And he was assigned in the city of Boston to the Naval Annex. And I remember when I was in high school, I went to see him. And I said, tell me about this Naval Academy thing and everything. He said, well, he said, your congressman is Edith Nurse Rogers. She was quite well known. She was very active at that time. And she is going to make the appointment. And what they're going to do is they're going to have a written examination for that. So I read, or somewhere, was able to keep track of the fact when this examination was going to be given. It was the regular college type application, and it was held somewhere. I guess it was held at the Navy Annex in the city of Boston. I showed up there one morning. There were about 50 kids, milling around this room, and they're all there to take the examination. And I'm saying, well, okay, I'm one of the bunch. They blow the whistle. We sit down. We do this examination. It takes about an hour. You turn in the examination and go home, and I don't hear anything. And I think did I say it might have been November that we took that examination? But anyway, in our home, in our kitchen, as a part of the kitchen was a breakfast nook. Sit right at the end of the kitchen, and my father and I were sitting once Sunday morning opposite each other at the table, and he's going through the Sunday paper as he normally does, and he looked up to me, he says, well, kid, you came in second.
Wow.
And I said, what are you talking about? He says, here it is right here, an article. Nurse picks people for the Naval Academy for the next class. And I said, let me read this. And it named a fairly well-known local marathoner. I forget his name now, Ted something. He was a student at Tufts University as the first principal. And it named me as the second principal, and then a whole bunch of follow-on backup people. And I said, what are you talking to me about? And I said, it says second principal. She's nominating two people, not just one, and I'm one of them. And my father says, well, I'll be damned. So that's how that happened. And, because the appointment was for the following year, I chose to spend the interim year after high school at Northeastern University, where I took a full engineering course for 1 year, and then in June of 1947, I went to Annapolis, where I had to check into the academy, pass the physical examination, and get sworn in as a midshipman in the class of 1951, which was going to be the next class to be filled. And ultimately, there were 751 people in the class of 1951, and we spent 4 years together.
So how did you come to join the Air Force?
That was strange. The Air Force did not have its own academy. This was in 1946. And the Secretary of the Navy decided that both West Point and the Naval Academy could contribute up to 200 from each class to go into the Air Force and be the nucleus of a permanent Air Force academy group, where ultimately they would build an academy and it would stand on a par with the schools at West Point and Annapolis. And in my senior year, things weren't going that great for me. And I wasn't really on the right side of my company commander, who was a commissioned officer in the Navy. And he even said to me one time, he says, we don't want guys like you in the Navy. And I said, that's all right with you. That's all right with me. I applied to go to the Air Force from the Navy, Naval Academy, and so that was that. And my first assignment was in Hondo, Texas, for primary flying training, which I went to in August of 1947. No, that's a lot of crap. I, I, I gotta rephrase that. I joined the Air Force upon graduation from the Naval Academy. And it was then in August that I was sent to Hondo, Texas for flying school.
And what jet aircraft were you trained on?
I didn't get to jet aircraft till somewhat later.
Oh, okay.
The primary aircraft that we learned to fly in was the Air Force version of the AT-6. In the Navy, it was a very familiar looking low-wing, painted yellow, two-seater airplane, front and back, that the Navy used as a training plane for their flying crews, which they normally trained at Pensacola. And I stayed there at Hondo, Texas, from the time we got there in August until January of the following year when I finished the course. And Hondo, Texas was way out in the back of nowhere. Nobody could ever find it. It was 50 miles west of San Antonio and about 50 miles from the border with Mexico. And it was a Air Force bomber base in World War II, where they had very, very nice concrete runways, 10-foot long runways, and a whole bunch of World War II built barracks type buildings that were their housing as well as the operations center and all of that. There was nothing there. I mean, it was absolutely nothing. And we eventually got a movie theater, and eventually they got an auditorium. What they did have was a runway, and they did have airplanes, and we did fly it every day. But it was really a very primitive type of location, and the airbase was run by civilian pilots. It was not run by the Air Force. The Air Force had officers in command, like the base commander was an Air Force colonel, perhaps, and some of the other officers, some of the other people were officers in the Air Force, but the bulk of the trainers were former pilots, ex-pilots from the World War II Air Force. Well, what am I hearing? Oh, okay. All right. So anyway, I had a civilian instructor. His name was Bob Shelley, and Bob was a P-51 pilot in the Far East during the end of World War II. And he was a little bit on the wild side. He rode a motorcycle, wore a leather jacket and leather boots, and he wasn't too much for rules and regulations. But he was a great pilot, and I learned well from him, and that was a good experience.
Well, good. And so you, after the Hondo Air Base, you went to Bryan?
Yes,
Texas?
I was transferred to Bryan, and that was my first exposure to jet airplanes. The first airplane we flew in Bryan was a North American airplane called the T-28, and it was kind of like an advanced trainer. It was one level higher, faster, and better than the T-6 that we really flew at Hondo. And we went through the course on the T-28s. When we were through that course, we transitioned into the jet side of the field, where they had the Lockheed T-33, which was the original fighter plane, actually, in the Korean War, which was the F-80, which was a single seat airplane, a one-pilot airplane, and eventually they made it into a two-seater, front and back. And the two-seater was called the T-33, and that's what we learned to fly in. And I flew from January until July in Bryan, Texas. And Bryan was really a great place. It's like so many air bases. It didn't really have a lot of creature comforts, but it had everything we needed. We liked the airplane. And Bryan is only 7 miles from College Station, which is the home of Texas A&M. So at times we could go to Texas A&M and see a football game. We could go to Texas A&M and use the golf course and play golf. And before we left Hondo and moved over to Bryan, I chose to get married. I was with a really good friend of mine from the Naval Academy. I knew who his girlfriend was at the Academy all through, and he decided he was going to get married. And this was toward the end of 1951. And I talked to Claire and I says, "What do you think?" She says, "Well, it's okay with me." So in November of 1951, we got married and we moved to Hondo, Texas. And because they had no living quarters on the base for a married couple, they had barracks for us, the pilots, we were able to rent a small single-bedroom home that was not very far from the air base, and I finished up my flying at Hondo, Texas, also with a wife. So when the time came, we moved to Bryan, Texas, where we were able to rent an apartment which was actually a part of a rather large Texas-style gray home owned by a widow. Her name was Mrs. Griffin, and she rented the apartment to us, and we moved in, and we spent the 6 months in Bryan, Texas there. And Claire was able to get a job in one of the agricultural laboratories at Texas A&M. She was a science major graduate from Harvard, and so she was pretty capable and had this temporary job for as long as we were in Bryan, Texas. And it was there that I graduated from pilot school and, actually got the wings that sat up here for 5 years after that, and was the beginning of my Air Force career.
And then you went to Nellis Air Force Base, Las Vegas, right?
That was, I went to Nellis. Nellis was the premier fighter school for the U.S. Air Force. They had the newest and the latest airplane, the F-86, which turned out to be the star of the Korean War, and I got to fly that airplane for 85 missions. At the time we were leaving Bryan, unfortunately, my discretion was not good, and Claire was pregnant. So I shipped her back, actually drove her back to Massachusetts, where she moved in with my parents and spent her time with my parents and her parents while I went to Nellis Air Force Base and learned how to be a fighter pilot. And I did that until November. So I went there in the summertime, and I stayed there until sometime into November, which moved into December because I caught a fairly serious cold. I had to stop flying for a while until I got over that, and in December I was finished with that, and I graduated from Nellis in December of 1951, and my next assignment was to go to Camp Stoneman and get shipped over to the Far East to join the 25th Fighter Interceptor Wing at Suwon, Korea, which was about 30 miles from Seoul. And that was kind of an interesting time, if you want to use a strange word for it. When I left Nellis, they gave me a week's leave so I could go back home to Massachusetts, to the General Hospital in Waltham, where David was born. And it was a question of how much time I was going to get and what was going on, and the doctor says, hey, worst come to worst, we'll induce labor and we'll force the child, which he ultimately did. So I stayed there for a couple of days after David was born, and then I was on an airplane to Camp Stoneman, where I ultimately got a flight to Tokyo. And this was a flight that flew on Christmas Day to go to Japan. And during Christmas Day, we crossed over the international date line, heading still toward Japan, which means there was no Christmas. we went from December 24th to December 26th, and we landed in Tachikawa, a Japanese air base outside Tokyo, on the 26th of December. And I stayed there in Japan for probably a week or so before we got passage that took us to Suwon, Korea, which was the F-86 base 30 miles from Seoul. And I spent the next 9 months there.
Which was your favorite duty station of those 4 that you just mentioned?
I think I liked Nellis the best just because the airplane was bigger, faster, swifter, smarter, all of those things. But maybe I had more fun at Hondo. First of all, a whole bunch of my friends from the Naval Academy who also joined the Air Force got shipped into Hondo. So there were probably 50 of us.
Oh my goodness.
That were all together Navy West. And that was a good time. And I think it was probably my favorite one of the duty stations. But they were all okay. Let me try. Well, you know, the one in Nellis was kind of strange. It was hot there. Oh, geez, it was so hot. You had to wear gloves to touch the skin on the airplane.
Okay.
And I remember they stuck us into a bachelor office quarters, and the air conditioning didn't work. So I looked around, and a couple of days later, I canvassed the base, and there were a whole bunch of empty buildings. And I picked one of the empty buildings in which the air conditioner worked, and I moved in. So I didn't live in the regular barracks in Nellis. I lived in my own place, somewhat apart, and that made me, I suppose, somewhat of a nonconformist, and that was sort of how I spent my time in the service. But anyway, that was an interesting part of the experience at Nellis, and not much more to say about it.
Okay, so tell us about your experience in Korea. Were you able to easily keep in touch with home?
U.S. mail never failed me.
All right.
No such thing as the internet. And pictures, sure, would send film home. But the U.S. was a long way away, and it took a long time to turn around films. But my mother kept all my letters. And I've started reading through them. She kept my letters not only from the ones in Korea, but from when I was in flying school in Nellis. There were probably 100 letters, which I have not completed reading. And I never thought they were really going to have much merit to them. And the reason for that is you don't write home about your war experiences. You don't tell them I got shot at or I shot at whatever, everything. Everything was always sweetness and light, and the sun was shining, and the letters were pretty drab. And occasionally I wrote a letter to my father which was a little more specific, but it was interesting that the letters survived. And we have them in the garage, and we have them all on the computer. Oh, nice. So one of these days I'm going to get finished reading those. And I was assigned to the 25th Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the 51st Fighter Wing of the 5th Air Force. And when I got there, we didn't hop into an F-86 right away. We had to sort of pre-qualify. And we spent some time flying around on in the area in some T-33s that they had, and also some F-86 drills, going up and learning a little bit about fighter tactics. And I'd never been in a fighter plane before. So, you know, how do you chase another airplane and how do you shoot at it? And that's what we were trying to learn. And we had to get into the rotation. The flights that took off every day were probably anywhere from 30 to 40 airplanes. And they took off in flights of 4. Each flight of 4 had a flight commander and an assistant flight commander. He flew in the number 3 position, and the 4 airplanes flew in a 4-fighter formation in pairs. So that the flight commander had one of the newbies as a wingman, whose job was follow me and make sure nobody shoots at me. And the same thing with the number 3 guy. He was also an attacker, and the number 4th guy in the squadron had to tail on after him and make sure he stayed safe. And we did that. It was very, very funny that before I got into a flight of 4 on the regular rotation of daily flights, they had 4 airplanes that would sit on the takeoff end of the runway as backups, and they were the scramble squad. They were extras. They were in to be used when needed or whatever, and I would go down there and would sit combat ready in the airplane, ready to be plugged in from the hydraulic unit to get fired up, if they wanted us to go up there and participate in the daily flight attack that was going on up north of the 38th parallel. And would sit there for a good half a day, get down there at 8 o'clock, sit in the airplane, and would be sitting there until noon. Before we got relieved, we were all dressed in combat gear and everything. Well, lo and behold, what happened? We got scrambled. So I got my first mission from being a scrambled pilot rather than being a part of the flight of formation of 4. But 4 of us went. We went up there, we went around there, and we did that for, I don't know, a couple of weeks. I don't know how long it went on, that I would be, and here's what happened, is that I wanted to fly. And we had a flight headquarters on the flight line where everybody hung out, and where the assignments were made. And I would hang out in the flight shack because I could get assigned to go sit on the end of the runway and be a scramble pilot if they wanted somebody. So that's how I got to participate that way. And I got about 6 missions before I went to my first organized pilots meeting before a flight like you see in the movies. Everybody comes into the auditorium, And they all sit around and all the brass gets up and they talk, and the weather guy talks, and the guy who was scouting talked, and people talked about their airplanes and all the rest of that stuff. And I'm sitting there, and I said something to one of the guys who was on the stage talking. I don't remember what it was that I asked him, but some other pilot needled me. He says, "What the hell are you doing that for?" Or, you know, he criticized me for interrupting doing that. I says, "Look, pal, this is my first time here." And I'd already had 6 combat missions. So I thought that was a pretty interesting take on making your way in the Air Force. But anyhow, we went on month after month with regular flights almost every day. Basically, you would fly about every second day. And a flight lasted about an hour and a half. The airplanes had extra fuel tanks. They looked like torpedoes, and they were attached one under each wing. And you would use that fuel to get into the war zone way north of, we had to fly 100 or so miles north of the 38th parallel to get up to the point where the MiGs were hanging out. And so we would burn all that fuel. And before we got into full combat readiness, we jettisoned the tanks. Just dropped the tanks. After the war, we used to joke that well, even during it, if you walked around Suwon, you'd see a lot of houses with nice shiny steel roofs, because the Koreans would collect the dropped airplane tanks and they would use it for building materials to build their houses. And eventually, I moved up to the number 3 position in my flight, and by the time I had flown 30 missions, I was a flight commander. And the way that happened was really, really ridiculous. This was 1952. The Army, the Air Force had a reduction in force, and they reduced officer strength throughout the entire Air Force. And guess who they reduced in strength? My flight commander, my flight leader, my 4-squadron flight leader. So I got to be the flight leader. And I spent the rest of my 85 missions as a flight commander, which was really unusual because you didn't ordinarily get to be a flight commander until you maybe had 70 or 80 missions, or until you extended for a second tour. But what it did for me is it gave me a lot of experience early. And it was, well, I liked doing it. I wanted to do it every chance I could. The reason I got 85 missions is I could hang around the flight shack, and they were going to put together a scramble squad, and I was going to be one of the guys who went. Otherwise, I would have had only half as many missions, and the reason I didn't get 100 missions is that the war stopped. In September, the war quit, and it was all over, and they buttoned everything up, and we all eventually went home. I don't know what to say. I've got some photos that you'll eventually see that showed that the living quarters we lived in were tin shacks. And in the center of the tin shack, there was a area set aside with some timbers that was full of sand. And in the sand was a wood stove. And the stove had a pipe that went up through a hole in the roof, and that's what kept us warm. And we slept on army cots, no beds, just army cots. We each had a footlocker, a box, which we could lock, which we could keep our belongings in, because we were using the Koreans as houseboys, and who the heck knew what they were going to steal? Well, anything they could get their hands on. So they weren't necessarily our friends, and that's pretty much the way it went.
How were you welcomed back home?
Negatively. You know, when I can remember coming back home. I flew back from Japan, from Seattle, and we flew into LaGuardia Air Force Base. And I'm I got all of these things on my uniform, and I'm walking around through the airport, and people are looking at me, staring at me. Seriously. I was persona non grata, unfavorable. All people who didn't like the war, didn't like the servicemen who were in the war, and the net result is we didn't meet any welcome committees at the bottom of the runway when we got off the airplane. And after that, in the time of trying to get acclimated, it still wasn't civilian life. I was still in the Air Force, and I got assigned to an air base in Georgia, Moody Air Force Base in Georgia. But readjusting to half military, half civilian life really didn't have a lot of charm. You know, we were just really not favored people, and I found that I thought about it for a while. I said, I'll never go fly for those bastards again. I mean, I just was turned off about the civilian population at that time. I wasn't fiery mad, you know. I wasn't incensed. I wasn't enraged. I wasn't angry that I went and somebody else didn't. It was all part of life, and it was all okay. But it didn't. If I wanted to think about it, it wasn't always really a happy experience. I had no problem with the people I knew. I go back home, and I'm back in my environment with people I knew, and that's how it was.
So when did you have your daughter? What year was that?
Oh, that was in 1955. We were at Moody Air Base. I was in the training command. We were teaching people how to fly a big, ugly beast of a night fighter called the F-89. And I was there from September of 1953 until the fall of 1955, when I was able to leave the Air Force. And I had a very good friend from pilot school in Hondo, going all the way back to 1951. He was a graduate of Colgate University. Name is Lloyd Van Zandt. And he and I were part of the Flight of Four, who were Bob Shirley's students. And I went to Korea, and Lloyd also went to Korea, but he went to the other side of the airfield where I was, and he was flying bomber missions in the F-80. And years later, after we got out of the Air Force, we first moved to Baltimore, and Lloyd moved to New Jersey. His wife, Midge, was from Ridgewood, New Jersey, and they moved to Princeton, and we used to visit back and forth. And they eventually, with their families, bought a townhouse in the Poconos Mountains where they would go for vacations and everything. And Claire and I used to visit with Midge and Lloyd frequently for a good many years. And one day I'm sitting in Moody Air Base. I'm sitting in the officers club. I don't know what I'm doing, but the woman walks in, sits down in a chair on the other side, and I look at her, and she looks at me, and I look at her, and she looks at me, and finally we speak, and it's Midge. I hadn't seen her for 2 years, and yes, Lloyd was along. They got assigned to Moody Air Base as well. So we each had houses in the same development, or quarters, I should say, in the same development, and we spent 2 years together. And that's when their daughter Susan was born. And we already had David. He was 3 years old. And one day Claire says to me, "I want another child." I said, "Have it your way." Yeah. And in May of 1955, Deborah was born.
Oh, nice. So you shared with me that you went to work in the electronics industry. for a major manufacturer.
Yeah, have we
electronic
finished? Have,
instrumentation.
have we finished with the Air Force?
Did you have more you want to talk about? I
Well,
absolutely want to hear about.
everybody's got, I suppose, war stories. But I want to tell you one. In the Air Force in Korea, it was like a gentleman's club. Great pilots from everywhere wanted to come over and fly with us because we had the airplanes, we had the war, we had the bullets. And when we how should I say that? There was an assignment, there was a group of Marines, really I don't know what you call them, squadron probably Marines that were stationed at Busan in South Korea. And two guys from that squadron were reassigned to the 25th, to my squadron, for 90-day temporary duty so they could get their feet with the war. One of them was John Glenn. You may remember John Glenn, the first guy who orbited the Earth. So things don't turn out very good for John Glenn and me because he took my airplane. He's a major and I'm a lieutenant. And he painted on this airplane, from the very front of the nose to the very end of the tail, the words "MiG, Mad Marine," in letters as high as you could put it on the airplane. And I had a photograph of that airplane, but I haven't been able to find it or whatever. And but after that, I got another airplane for me, and I used to fly wingman for John Glenn occasionally. And I can recall one time I'm circling around at about 20,000 feet, and I get the word the airfield is closed. And it turns out we got a dead stick on in the flight pattern. Somebody had flamed out. The F-86 was very, very good at flaming out at the wrong altitudes, and sometimes you couldn't get it started, which means you had to think about the parachute as the next step down to Mother Earth. And I'm flying around, and I'm watching this airplane do descending circles over the airplane, and eventually he came around and he set that airplane down with no power, no fuel or anything, right on the runway. It was John Glenn. The guy was a superior pilot then. He was really, really very good. And he wasn't a bad guy. But anyway, that was my introduction to fame or famous people. But another time, it was even funnier. It's in July. And I fly a mission up north, and I come back after the mission, and I land on the runway. And they had been doing some repair work on the revetment area where we parked our airplane. So I couldn't just turn off the runway and go to my normal parking space. I had to park in a parking space halfway up the runway, and to cross over the runway and go to my parking space. So I pull up and I call the Tower Eagle leader to cross the active runway, and I get the word back. I say, hold your position, we got an emergency on final. And I say, okay, so I sit there and I look, and not too long after, this big blue F-9 Navy airplane comes sailing by, no wheels. And he lands right in front of me, makes sparks all over the place, and all hell breaks loose. We got fire trucks, we got foam trucks, we got everything trying to salvage his airplane, and the pilot jumps out, Ted Williams. That's how I met a famous baseball player. And Ted came over to the officers' club the night of that, and John Glenn had brought a friend with him. When I said two guys came from Busan, his name was Harvey Jensen. He was the captain. Harvey and I got to be really, really good friends. And Harvey and I would even fly missions together. He would get an F-86, and I would be flying. One day, we're up there at 40,000 feet, and I'm looking over and I see Harvey's airplane, and here's my airplane. And suddenly, Harvey goes like this. This is very early in Harvey's F-86 career. But he goes like this, and then he goes that way. And I said, oh, geez, I'll bet he didn't turn on his oxygen. So I went chasing after him. I chased him down to about 10,000 feet, and I lost him. And I thought, oh, I didn't see any flames or any smoke or anything. Nobody crashed. So I said, well, so much for that. And later when I'm checking out of the combat zone, I'm calling combat ops saying that I'm going home. And I hear a voice over the loudspeaker, Eagle yada yada, check it out of the combat zone, and it's Harvey. Harvey had flown unconscious to 10,000 feet before he recovered, and then he was able to recover his airplane and he was able to fly back to the base. So those are some of my friendship stories.
Awesome.
But you know, after that, if we go fast forward, yeah, after the Air Force, I decided it just wasn't the right place for us. My wife was not necessarily the biggest adventurous person, and she was really a homebody. And the idea of moving every X to some different place was something she really didn't like about that. And we're still living at Moody Air Base, and this is in the summertime when Deborah was born. Deborah was 3 weeks old, and I got assigned to a group who was going to go to fly a summer flight exercise in Oscoda, Michigan, at the air base there, from Georgia to Michigan. So there I am with a 3-month-old daughter, a wife who's not necessarily the greatest at being a new mother, even though this is a second time, and I go off to Oscoda for, geez, at least 3 months on this temporary. It was a U.S. war exercise with airplanes all over the field, and I'm talking to Claire, and I say, you know, this ain't going to fly. And so I decided that I'd resign my commission, that we would just leave the Air Force, and I did that. You know, the question is, after that, what do you do? And I took a job with Procter & Gamble, and the reason I went with them is that they were a large company, and they had good training programs. And, you know, they trained me how to be a civilian and how to work in civilian life, and so I worked in one of their factories for a couple of years until I got bit by the sales bug. I said, well, really, it seems to me my friends that are making money are doing it in a sales job. So I got a sales job with a company called Taylor Instrument Company in Rochester, New York. They aren't there as Taylor anymore, and they made process control instrumentation to run factories. You know, if you were going to run a paper mill, you needed all kind of instrumentation to run the machinery, and if you were going to run a, I don't know, even a cider mill, you need temperature measuring instruments for all the things that you do. And I became a salesman for Taylor, and I stayed with them for 3 years until I got a better job. Well, what happened is that my sales job with Taylor was in Baltimore, and I had a companion sales with me, an elderly man. That's the wrong word to say, because but he was pushing 65 at that time, and they closed the office, and we had a home in Baltimore and all that sort of stuff. They closed the office and transferred me to Richmond, Virginia. And I went to Richmond, and I said, well, you know, I don't think I'm really happy living here in the South. My wife is still in Baltimore, and eventually we get together in Richmond, but I don't like that too much either, so I got another job with a company called Brush Instruments. They made measuring instruments. You know, when you get an EKG and they run the blue line across the orange paper? Well, we invented that kind of equipment. We didn't invent the heart recorder, but we invented that machine, which was used to monitor the life performance of the Mercury astronauts when they went up in the Gemini and the first of the spaceships to the moon. Our instrumentation was doing the health monitoring for all of the crews and keeping records for that. So anyway, that turned out to be a pretty good job because we started in Baltimore, where I had been with Taylor Instruments, and then eventually I got promoted to be district manager in Chicago, and we moved to Chicago. We lived there for 2 years, and I got promoted again to the company headquarters, the corporate headquarters in Cleveland, where I became the general sales manager of one of their other divisions. Not the division I had originally got hired for, but one of the others I was the sales manager. And I kept that job for 65, probably 2 years or more, and then I got promoted to general manager of that division. And I became the youngest general manager in the history of Cleveland Corporation, and I thought that I was off to a pretty good career. And this sounded really good. So life went on, and eventually my boss, when I was a sales manager for that division I got promoted to from Chicago to move to Cleveland, my boss, who was the division manager of that division, he had been the general manager, the general sales manager of the sales force in the first brush instrument job that I had. When I first took the job, and I had the job in Baltimore for a while, and then we moved to Chicago. He became general manager of this other division, and when I became the general sales manager, it was because he picked me to move to Cleveland to be the general sales manager of his division, which lasted for about 3 years when things didn't work out so well, and he got fired. How should I say this? Well, yeah, what happened? Well, this gets very complicated. We were in the mid-'60s, and this was the time of industrial conglomerates. I don't know if you would recall the 60s, but you remember people like ITT in New York, that they had, I don't know, 100 and some divisions of corporate entities, and there were corporations forming all over the country, and we were the target of an unfriendly takeover by a New York corporation and some venture capitalists. And at that time, my boss didn't survive the early days of the takeover. Things just, they were different kind of companies. They just didn't work. So I got his job as the general manager of Brush Instruments. And I kept that job for 3 years. Yeah, and tried to work it out, and through a lot of things that happened that I didn't have a damn thing to do with, I got fired. And I was really pissed. I said, I've never been fired. never did anything that would justify that kind of an activity. And eventually, Gould went on to ultimately go out of business. I mean, they bought a couple of divisions and they did some stuff, and they moved into rolling mills, Illinois, but Gould eventually went out of business. I don't know, they've been out of business for 10 years or more than that. That's how great the guys were who took it over and who were going to run it. But anyway, here I am, I get fired. We're living in Ohio, where I'm a general manager of Brush Instruments, and what am I going to do? And I looked at Claire and I said, well, what's up for you? And she said, I'd like to go back home. I said, okay, I'll see what I can find. So I went to Massachusetts, and I looked around, and I spent some time talking to people, and I found a company in Cleveland, Ohio, and I bought an executive search people franchise. Find executives for corporations. What the hell? I was an executive. Who's better at finding an executive for a corporation but me? And I kept that for 6 years, and I hated it. We succeeded. We were alive for 6 years, and I eventually sold it. But during that 6 years, I left it a couple of times, picked somebody else to be my office manager, and I went off and I got a job. I had a job with a startup instrument company in Nashua, New Hampshire. Let me put this thing in context. During the time, let me get this right, that I had the how did I get to Amherst? Well, anyway, when I got out of the employment business, I got a job with a microwave parts company, microwave component company. And that job was in Detroit, in a suburb of Detroit. We moved to Detroit, and I stayed there for a year. And I had a boss. Well, the company was owned by 4 scientists, really, from one of the major corporations, and they had built this company up to about $15 million, and something I didn't know is that in the long term they wanted to sell it. But I got the job there as general manager, and the guy who was my boss was somebody I had known from somewhere else, who actually brought me in to be the boss, and he had the hots on New Hampshire as a place to be a manufacturing hub. That was the time people were diversifying, and they were finding semi-rural places and good workforces and all of that. So he and our company, the microwave company in Detroit, got unionized by the United Auto Workers, and nothing fried my management more than having their workforce taken over by a union. So my boss said, we're going to move. And he had the hots for New Hampshire. We're going to move to New Hampshire. I want you to move the company to New Hampshire. So ultimately, over the next year, we moved the company to New Hampshire. I moved to New Hampshire from Detroit. Bought a lovely home in Amherst, New Hampshire. It was one of the finest homes I ever had. 50-mile view to Mount Monadnock across the state of New Hampshire, and just a delightful place to be. And lo and behold, I find out a couple of years later that the bosses of my company did want to sell the company. But the way they sold it is they merged it with another similar company. And the way the merger worked out is that the guy who was the head of the company it was merged into was the president of that company. He was the senior officer. He got to be the president of the whole works, and I got to go look for a new job. And I said, well, how can this happen to me twice in my life? So then I fooled around, and then I got a job where I went with a startup. They were going to start a new printer. Like you see, all your photocopy printers emanated from Xerox. But I was also in businesses that did printer work and made printers. And I joined a startup for a printer with a guy named Royden Sanders. He was the head of Sanders Associates in Nashville, New Hampshire. He's a well-respected guy, made a lot of money and all the rest of that stuff. But the printer that his group developed just wasn't going to make it in the marketplace. So I wound up leaving that job, stewed around a while, wound up again with the guy who had gotten me into the microwave company in the first place. He was now then associated with a company in New York who had invented a real special kind of electronic circuit board. And they had a small satellite plant. The corporation was in New York, but they had a satellite plant outside of Dallas in Euless, Texas. And what they wanted to do was clone this plant. And the guy I told you who had been my boss, who had the hots for New Hampshire, he said, I want you to clone this company and take it and set up one in New Hampshire. And I said, okay. I was invited to go, and this was also under the aegis of some venture capital people in New York. And so I went to Dallas for a weekend to look it over to see, and I was going to go there a month. I'd be there a month and look this company over and see what the elements were, pick it up and move it to New Hampshire. And by the end of 3 days, I'm back to my boss, who at that then had become a different boss. I know this is confusing, but my original boss who got me into it actually put me with the guy who was working with the venture capitalists, who actually was sort of the boss of this little company. And I went to him and I said, this is not going to fly. I mean, I said, you got a guy here for general manager who doesn't know from anything and he's never going to make it. So he fired him. So what happens? I get to stay there and be the general manager of this company. And I stayed there 1.5 years. And I thought, holy smoke, how did this ever happen? And by the way, we're doing okay with this company, except we're coming to the end of the 1.5 years, and I'm saying to myself, what gives? I'm not going to stay here for the rest of my life. I'm in Texas, for crying out loud. And my wife is living in a lovely home in New Hampshire. And meanwhile, living with my wife is her mother who has Alzheimer's disease, which makes this thing more complicated. So anyway, I have to decide whether I want to move to Dallas or whether I don't, and we don't. So we go out and we hire somebody to be my replacement as general manager, and here I am. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do, but I'm not going to live in Texas, and I go back home to New Hampshire. And meanwhile, for 25 years, we're owners of a summer vacation cottage on Moosehead Lake in Maine. 40-mile-long lake, great fishing and all that. My parents had originally bought it in the 1960s. I took it over in the 70s, and we kept it. And we went there a couple of times, and I came back home, and what was I doing? I was looking around for something, and I said to Claire, I said, would you be up to something really wild? And she says, tell me. And I says, well, the motel up there at Moosehead Lake is for sale. And what would you think about being in the hotel business for a while? And she says, well, not too much. By the way, I don't know if this is the time to divert it, but all this time we're talking about my career, she's trying to run her own business. She's got 2 master's degrees and a master's degree in reading from the University of Akron, and I had convinced her while we were still living in Ohio to start a reading clinic. And we started a reading clinic. And we closed the reading clinic when we moved to Amherst, but when we were living in Amherst for 5 years, we started the reading clinic again, and she was doing that, and she was sort of, well, when I went to Texas to take that job that was going to help me move that company to Texas, we decided that we were going to close the reading center. Now, the way we closed it, we had bought a house, remodeled it, and made it into a schoolroom. I sold that, and I found space in a nearby commercial district, built a couple of rooms for her to teach her reading, and then I went off to Dallas, Texas. I know this is an absolutely stupid story. You'll never be able to keep up with it. But anyway, I talked to the guy who had the motel in Maine, and no way were we going to live in Maine. We weren't going to do anything. But comes along, Claire says to me a couple of weeks ago that she says, John Tracy, who we knew, was a guy who owned a campground, had an office next to where she had her reading center, and John was partners with two guys in a motel in North Conway, New Hampshire, and they were losing hat and ass, and they didn't know what they were going to do with it. So one day, Claire and I picked the lock on his office, went through his files, read everything we could about the motel in trouble in New Hampshire, and then we went to John with a proposition. We say, John, what are you doing with the motel? He says, well, I'm losing my general manager, and the motel is actually for sale. And I said, oh, is it really? So we dick around with this thing for a month or two, and then by January 1st of 1982, we are proprietors of a ski lodge in Jackson, New Hampshire, right next to Mount Washington, and where I'm going to ski all winter and play golf all summer. You remember I said I'm never going back to the corporate world, and I can't say that my experiences in the corporate world were all that rewarding. So we buy this motel, and I got a zillion pictures on the computer for you when and if you want them of our life for 13 years as hotel owners in the motel business, and it turned out to be one of the best, as far as I'm concerned, looking back on it, was one of the best times of my life, because I was working for myself, and I was doing things that I wanted to do. It was hard, really, really a tough business. And the time we were there, I completely remodeled a 33-room hotel. Have you ever bought 60 air conditioners all at one time? Not 60, 30. Have you ever bought 30 air conditioners in one shot? Or 66 beds? It's a real experience. But anyway, we were able to remodel the hotel, not Holiday Inn or Sonesta quality. We just didn't have the money. We were doing all this on the cheap, on the fly, with my hammer and my nails and my paintbrush. And so we did that for 13 years while we had the motel. In addition to remodeling the hotel, I had always wanted to build a house. And on the motel property, there was a service building which had our big furnace, and it was our laundry room and some other stuff, and it had a small apartment on the second floor. That was where Claire and I moved in when we first bought the motel. So what did I do in the early 1980s? I started building a house attached to our service building. I built a 50 by 25 foot house, 2 levels, 3-car garage underneath it. Did that all the time while we were working, running the motel, finishing the remodel job and all the rest, and I guess having a good time at it until one of these days I'm watching Claire set a table in the restaurant. And the fork is going here, and the knife is going over here, and the sugar urn is going over here. And I said, what the hell is going on? And she doesn't know where she's putting them. And damned if she didn't get Alzheimer's. She got Alzheimer's when she was 63 years old. And by the time she was 65 years old, we had sold the motel. We sold it under duress because this was when Ronald Reagan was president. Ronald Reagan had the bright idea that he was going to pass the Tax Act of 1986, in which all tax breaks for discretionary and non-primary property we're not going to be able to take the tax deductions anymore. So New England immediately went from wherever it was to $14 billion in surplus real estate, hotels and everything else, she's got Alzheimer's, and I'm saying, I can't run this anymore. I really can't, so we sell it in 1995. Moved here. Not to here, moved to Ventura. And we were in Ventura for about a year before I had her in a home, a caregiver's home. She stayed there for 6 years before she finally passed away in 2006. And I've been tying my own shoes ever since. That's kind of I don't know how much of that you could write, and I don't know how much you'd really want to save or record. It just tells you, I suppose, one of the things you can say about, call it veterans, or how lives get jumbled up and how people recover. There is life after. You know, if something ends, you can go find something else.
You told me, in that vein, you told me that you were very active in senior men's golf. You're a board member, treasurer.
Well, I was the treasurer and the membership chairman of the Senior Men's Club of the Ventura Senior Golf Club. And I did that for 28 years. I just gave that up 3 years ago.
So that shows you were positive thinking.
Well, I don't know. Something was like fire at my heels. Something had to give. So anyway, I've lived here 12 years. I've lived here since 2013. And it's not going to be that much longer. You know, well, in 1995 when I came here, I was 65. That's when I retired, started retirement. But I didn't retire. While we were owners of the Motor Inn, I got my real estate license. I got my broker's license. And around the Motor Inn, there used to be individual summer chalets for people, and we used to be a participant in the real estate business, selling those. So when I came here, I got a job as a real estate agent in Ventura. And we did that for a while until it didn't work because I had Claire at home. We were getting her ready to put her in the home and everything. So that ended. And what should I? Well, I use the comment. I've lived here 12 years. Before moving here, when we moved from the Motor Inn to California, we moved to a home that my son had on the beach at Ventura. And I lived there from 1995 until 2013 when I moved here. And then I came here to be in a retirement community. But the point is that 1995, I'm 65 years old, and here I am 30 years later. You know, I've already had my retirement. I'm not retiring. I'm not going anywhere. My retirement's over. And you know, my next step is just living here as long as I can, and there's not too much mileage left on the tires. But at least I'm still here talking to you.
Yes, and you're happy with, and you're close with your children?
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
David and Deborah? And
Yeah,
so you have that?
Yeah, I see David regularly. He's going back to England pretty soon. He's a film producer. He's been doing that for 40 years anyway. He just finished a year ago the film Wicked. If you saw
Very
that,
popular, yeah.
if you saw that film.
I haven't seen it. I saw the play, but yeah. I know
Well,
what you mean,
okay,
yeah.
the play, the movie is a takeoff of the play. That's where its source was. Anyway, they made Wicked as two films. They made the first half, which they showed last December, and they put the other half in the can, which they're going to open up again at Christmas time this year. But they have to do some finished photography, and David's going back to England probably in like a week or two to get going with that. So my life with him has been kind of intermittent here because he found his love life in New York, and they've been together 15 years, and she's not moving from New York. She's a radiologist in the Mount Sinai Hospital network, so he splits his time between here and there. And my daughter, unfortunately, is confined to a wheelchair, but she does live by herself in an apartment complex in Santa Clarita. And I used to see her more than I do, but I'm not driving at nights anymore that much. So we talk on the phone. But I would say we're pretty close. I've got a granddaughter who married a Scotchman, and they got 2 kids with Scotch accents, and which I should understand a whole hell of a lot better than I do, because they talk just like my grandparents did. and my Lily is David's daughter, and David has a son, Alex, and Alex has 2 boys, a boy, I don't know, 8 and 6, who are in school. They live in Los Angeles, and I get to see them periodically.
Well, that's wonderful.
So that's my home life.
Do you have any parting messages to people who are going to view this? Ancestor descendants or genealogists or?
Well, you know, we joined Ancestry.com, and we went through the DNA bit, and I got the DNA, and I got all the results from DNA, and I put it in a folder, and I filed the folder, and I don't know where the hell it is. I have looked, and I've looked, and I've looked, and I've looked, and I can't find it. So Ancestry does not seem to really play a big part in my life. And, you know, I'm always asked, how did you make it this long? How did you get to the end like this? And I said, there's no big secret to it. You just take care of yourself and love the people around you, and go from there.
That's a good
and
message.
it's worked out.
That is a good message.
So here at Leisure Village, over the 12 years I've been here, I've probably known over 500 people. I mean, people are long since gone, but I can't, and I don't know how many friends I have now, a couple of hundred. I used to be very active in the workshop. We would repair furniture and everything for the residents of Leisure Village, and I told you I built a house, and I used to make furniture, so that fit right in with that. I was a member of the racket club, paddleball tennis club here for the until I was, till 2 years ago, till I was 94, and I blew out my knees, so I can't play racquetball anymore. But since there's 100 people in the racket club, I know all of them. I belong to the billiard club, which I'm still playing. I was in the tournament last week, got beat in the 3rd round. But at least I'm able sort of to still play in a half-assed way. But there are 80 and 90 members of the billiard club. I know them. If I stop the activities, if I stop being with the people, they're going to forget me. I'm going away. And I'm trying to dig my heels in as deep as I can to try to preserve what's left. So for me, every day is a great day. No matter what happens, I know when I get up in the morning, something's going to happen that day that turns it into a great day, and the day will be okay, and I look forward to those. Today's a great day. Who would have planned or thought that we were going to have a day like this, and this opportunity to go through this exercise and this experience, and it's tearing me up. Sorry.
Well, we so appreciate that you're doing this for us, that you're sharing all these memories, good and sad and.
Well, I guess there were a lot of memories.
Yeah,
Jeez,
so many.
It's been a lot of years.
Yeah, it sure has. If you had a message to people to help them learn and react, how would you advise them to deal with veterans?
How to deal with veterans? Well, I don't think you do anything different from what you have. You have half the population who are proud of veterans and will wave the flag at a parade for them, and you got the other half of the population who hate them for whatever it is that they've done. They annihilated countries, they killed all the Vietnamese, all and on and on. There's nothing glorious about being a veteran, particularly if you shot somebody. So I would say that maybe, well, it's hard. We're not at war. When I was a kid, I told you my father, after he got out of the Navy in World War I, and that was an active social organization. They had picnics, they had conventions, and they would go to different cities for an annual convention and stuff like that, and the veterans were a pretty powerful group, like other social organizations. And if the veterans can be visible, be active, we're not drafting people, so we're not collecting members of the service, and we're not sending people off to war anymore since Afghanistan. And so people want to forget the veterans. The last thing in the world they want is to be drafted. The second last thing in the world they want is their kid to get drafted. So we're not going to like the veterans any better than we like them now.
Well, that's one reason the DAR, which I'm also a member of, and Colonial Dames support veterans groups
Sure.
and veterans activities and honoring veterans every November. And I'm sure there are many, many social groups that do the same thing.
Well, I know there are many social groups around who make a part of their activities being involved with veterans in one way or another. Helping them when they have, let's say, medical or psychological problems, help them when they have employment problems, help them when they too get sick. Sure, there's all of that out there, and that's available. I think the veterans get a lot of support.
Yeah,
I mean, if you look at what percentage of the population of veterans and how much they're able to consume or benefit from, I should say, the social and the services networks that are available in this country, I think they do pretty well.
Yeah, no, I enjoy talking with veterans and doing what I can.
I mean, a veteran is just like somebody else who, at some point in his life, got tossed into an untenable situation, and he had to cope.
Right. But you also learn so much. You learn how to fly jets and
Well, yeah,
see other
yeah,
countries.
I agree. Certainly, it's been my education. This is my education, sitting here.
Yeah. You want to tell us about your medals here that are sitting in front of you?
No, I don't have anything to say. I flew a lot of medals. I flew a lot of missions and got the Flying Cross and a lot of missions and got the air medals, and as a reward they gave me a cigarette lighter.
For your health.
Yeah. What else can you say?
I want to thank you so much for
Are we-
spending the time and for gathering all your information and documents, and we look forward to seeing it all put together.